Hello everyone, I'm Nick Fortin, Deer and Moose Project Leader for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and in this presentation I'm going to go over the results of the 2020 deer hunting seasons and the department's recommendation for antlerless harvest and the youth hunting season this coming fall. 2020 was an unusual year for several reasons. First, we changed a lot of deer hunting regulations intended to improve hunter recruitment and retention, and also increase our harvest where we needed to. On top of that, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, which gave people a lot of time. Together, those two things resulted in a pretty substantial uptick in the number of hunters and the amount of time those hunters spent in the woods in 2020. And that did have, or likely had, a pretty substantial impact on the harvest. In addition to those more obvious factors, we also saw fairly unusual patterns in deer activity and deer behavior, and we don't know whether that was related to the weather or to food availability or some other factor, but the result was that hunters saw fewer deer per day or per hour than they had in recent years. And so for hunters who were unsuccessful, at least, the perception was that it was a fairly challenging season. In the end, the total deer harvest in 2020 was 18,991 deer. Now that's more than 2019, but very similar to the harvest we saw in 2018. Much of the increase was in the antlerless deer harvest, and that was largely the intent of many of the regulation changes that took effect last year. Now, when we break it down and look at individual season harvest, we see it was much more of a mixed bag in 2020. The archery harvest set a new all-time record at 6,165 deer. Now, we expected some increase in the archery harvest due to several different regulation changes relating to archery season, but this exceeded our expectations. Now, we believe certainly that the new regulations had an effect, but also that the COVID-19 pandemic kind of increased archery hunting participation more rapidly than we expected. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in this coming fall in 2021, but hopefully we can maintain the number of archery hunters we had this past year. Now, the youth season, and indeed many of the other seasons, were a different story. The youth harvest was down quite a bit from 2019, and in fact the lowest youth weekend harvest we've had since it became a two-day season back in 2002. Now, we don't know if that decline is related to poor weather conditions during that season, or because we moved the season 2 weeks earlier and so there's less buck activity at that time of year, or if it's just a continuation of a longer term downward trend in the youth weekend harvest. Now, we also had our first ever novice hunting season in 2020, and so I want to show a few quick facts on that season. Those hunters ended up harvesting a total of 126 deer. We did end up with more than 1,000 novice hunters, which was quite a few more than we expected. Of course, we don't know, again, if that was related to the pandemic and having online hunter education this past year, or if we're just recruiting more people than we actually expected to. But either way, that's certainly a good thing. Now, the harvest during our regular rifle season in November was down a little bit from the previous 4 years, but still one of the better rifle season harvests we've seen over the past 15 years since the antler restriction took effect back in 2005. So for what some might call a down year, it was still a pretty good year. Now, the muzzleloader harvests this past year were actually quite a bit lower than we expected, given some of the new seasons in hunting regulations. So the December muzzleloader kill was down quite a bit from recent years, despite basically the same number of antlerless permits in hunters' hands in December. And you know, we don't know if that's partly related to, again, that unusual deer behavior, limited deer activity that we saw later in the season this year, or if this is just a relation to that having that early October muzzleloader season now where hunters can fill their antlerless permits early. And if we look at the combined muzzleloader harvest, so both the early 4-day October muzzleloader season and the December season, we see that the harvest was actually up. And obviously we'd expect that with 4 additional days. But we really still didn't see the high antlerless permit fill rates that we were expecting and many people were expecting given those 4 early days to hunt. Now, one of the other changes that took effect in 2020 was an increase in the bag limit across all seasons from 3 deer to 4 deer. And as you can see here, only about 1%, actually just under 1% of all successful hunters managed to reach that 4 deer bag limit. And to keep that in perspective, only about 20% or 1 in 5 hunters is successful at harvesting any deer at all. So this is a very, very small fraction of hunters that manages to reach that 4 deer limit. And lastly, I want to touch on the impact of some of our new buck hunting regulations on our buck harvest. So, the best way to look at that is to look at the percentage of our total buck harvest that was yearling bucks, or 1.5-year-old bucks. Now, prior to the antler restriction, back before 2005, anywhere from 50 to 65% of the buck harvest each year was 1.5-year-old bucks. It's obviously been much lower with an antler restriction in place because most of those bucks are off limits. And of course, in 2020, we removed the antler restriction in about half of our WMUs, and we also went to a 1 buck annual limit statewide. So what we saw this past year was a little bit higher yearling percentage in those WMUs where we removed the antler restriction, but still well under 50%. And we know if we stay under 50%, we can at least maintain the percentage of mature bucks, those 3- and 4+-year-old bucks that we currently have in our population. And if we can maintain the percentages we saw this past year, less than 40% yearlings, we probably will actually see an increase in the proportion of older bucks in our population as we move forward. Now, as we transition into discussing this fall's antlerless harvest recommendation, I want to first touch on exactly how we manage deer populations. Now, we do that by adjusting the annual mortality rate, or specifically the annual mortality rate for does, females. And we can look at the age structure of our female population over time, which is shown here. We see that about 21% on average of our doe population are yearling does, or 1.5-year-old deer. Now, I won't get into the math of why this works, but the percentage of yearlings is equal to the mortality rate in a stable population. And although it goes up and down over time, our deer population has been relatively stable. So we know that on average, about 21% of our doe population dies each year to keep the population stable. So if we want to reduce a population, we need mortality to be greater than 21%. If we want to see a population increase, we need total mortality to be less than 20%, 21%. And so this is what we're trying to do with our harvest recommendation each year, is adjust this total mortality. Of course, that requires us to estimate what percentage of deer are going to die from non-hunting causes. And for the most part, that's related to winter severity. So in Vermont, winter is really the primary limiting factor for deer in most areas. And so we keep track of a winter severity index. So we tally 1 point for every day the temperature is below 0, and 1 point for every day where the snow on the ground is 18 inches deep or more. We sum that up through the winter. And we know that through research and through long-term monitoring that this index relates very well to the percentage of deer that are going to die as a result of the winter. And so we track this through time. And what we found last year, we had a statewide winter severity index of about 30 points, which is a relatively easy winter. And that was really true across the state. But winter severity certainly wasn't the same all across the state. So we do track winter severity at the wildlife management unit level. And what we saw last year was a pretty typical pattern where winters are harder in northern Vermont, particularly the Northeast Kingdom, and easier in the Champlain Valley or the Connecticut River Valley. So this is the information we input into our models to figure out, what percentage of our deer do we expect to die as a result of winter or other non-hunting causes, and therefore what do we need to account for with hunting in our recommendation this fall. So despite a relatively easy winter this past winter, because of our higher antlerless harvest this past fall and in previous years, we're actually predicting about a 5% decline in our deer population for this coming fall, so down to about 133,000 deer. Importantly, in many areas, that's still above our population objectives. Now, deer population objectives, or deer density objectives, expressed here as deer per square mile of deer habitat, are set in the department's 2020 to 2030 Big Game Management Plan. Now, these goals represent department biologists' best estimate based on all of the information available to us and all of the research out there on deer and habitat relationships. These are our best estimate of how many deer these areas can support long term, given the current and expected future condition of the habitat in those areas. But really, our overarching deer management goal is to maintain a healthy, sustainable deer population. So we know that at higher densities, or certainly when deer exceed the level their habitat can support, they have lower reproductive rates, lower body weights. That means fewer of them survive the winter, and of course bucks grow smaller antlers. On the other hand, at lower densities, or when deer are in balance with their habitat, we see higher reproductive rates, higher body weights. That means better winter survival. And of course, those bucks are also going to be bigger, which means they can grow bigger antlers. And what we've seen over the past about 30 years now here in Vermont is the slow, steady decline in the physical condition of our deer. Now that tells us that our deer population, at least in some areas, has exceeded what our habitat can support long term. And we believe that the primary reason for this decline isn't so much that our deer population has increased, because it really hasn't. It's been relatively stable over the past 30 years. But rather, our forests are getting older, and they're simply not able to support the number of deer that they used to. Far more of our forests today look like this forest on the right, with very little in the understory, very little food for deer. We have very little young forest habitat, like this one on the left, which provides a lot more food and cover for deer and would support a much higher number of deer. And we have data from the U.S. Forest Service from plots that they collect around Vermont on both public and private land that clearly demonstrates this decline in the amount of young forest habitat that is out there today. And again, the availability of this habitat has a significant influence on how many deer our forests and our deer habitat in general can support. And that brings us to our 2021 antlerless recommendation, and specifically our management objectives for this coming fall. So based on our population projections, we expect there to be 7 wildlife management units where our deer population this coming fall will still be well above the objectives set in the Big Game Plan. So our goal in those areas is to continue to reduce the population toward those population objectives. In the rest of Vermont, in the other 14 wildlife management units, our goal is to stabilize deer numbers at roughly where they're at now. Sometimes that still means maintaining a higher antlerless harvest, particularly if we keep having mild winters. But our goal is to kind of maintain the numbers we have now in those areas. Now, this year's recommendation is a bit different than most years, largely because there's still a great deal of uncertainty about just what our harvest might be this fall, largely because of both the new regulations and any continued effect they might have on the harvest, but also the hopefully end of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we don't know ultimately what effect these things will have on our deer harvest. So to account for that, we're taking kind of a very conservative approach and assuming the high-end harvest scenario, so the highest realistic harvest we might expect to see. So for our archery season, we're assuming essentially the same archery hunting effort, the same number of hunters, the same number of hours or days per hunter, and essentially the same archery harvest as we saw in 2020. And we're also expecting to see a fairly substantial uptick in our antlerless permit fill rate during the muzzleloader seasons. So, last year we were planning on about a 25% fill rate, and we didn't see much of an uptick at all. We are assuming that will happen this year. We will see a higher permit fill rate, and so we are planning on that much higher fill rate than we've had in the past. So there are three parts to our annual antlerless recommendation each year, and these first two usually aren't overly controversial and don't garner a lot of attention, but they are that the archery season, antlerless hunting will be allowed in all wildlife management units during the archery season. And during the youth and novice season, those youth novice hunters will be allowed to shoot one deer of either sex, and the antler restriction will not apply in any WMU. So whether that WMU has an antler restriction or not, it will not apply during the youth or novice season. Those are typically the rules every year, but they are part of our recommendation. And really the key part of our antlerless recommendation is the number of muzzleloader antlerless permits that we issue in each WMU. So in total in 2021, we're recommending 20,000 antlerless permits distributed in 19 of our 21 WMUs. So there are no permits in WMUs E1 or E2. And based on that roughly 25% fill rate that we're expecting, that will result in the harvest of about 5,000 antlerless deer during the muzzleloader seasons in October and December. If anyone has questions about specific WMUs and what our goals and objectives are there, I would strongly encourage you to review the antlerless recommendation document that is on the Fish and Wildlife website. It has a lot of information on each WMU and exactly what our concerns and objectives are for those areas. For more information on the 2020 deer harvest or the department's 2021 antlerless harvest recommendation, visit vtfishandwildlife.com.